Today, I will share some thoughts and research with you on fear, its neurobiology, and some techniques and strategies to address, mitigate, and alleviate it. So to begin, I will share with you a couple of traumatic personal experiences that have contributed to one of my primary phobias. When I was 12 years old, I was horsing around with some school friends, and oddly, young prepubescent boys tend to express their mutual affection quite strangely through benign acts of cruelty. We were giving each other flat tires and flicking each other's ears and such, and I don't specifically recall what I did to provoke such a response, but quite suddenly my good mates thrust me into a school locker and slammed the door shut, trapping me in a very tight, black, cold, lonely encasement. It didn't take long for intense panic to set in. I began bellowing, kicking the metal door with my feet and pounding it with my fists. And in reality, I don't really know how much time elapsed during this sardining, maybe 60 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And I've since actually tried to imagine the courage it must have taken to release me, given my obvious distress, and the gumption for such bravery probably took some additional time to summon. But when I was liberated, it was not a pretty sight. I staggered out, flailing my arms wildly, snot and spit spewing forth as if from an untended garden hose, and unable to focus my vision, I spiraled aimlessly around like a whirling dervish, expanding the circumference of the circle of kids who had gathered like spectators at a zoo. And finally, my buddies had to tackle me to the floor and subdue me, where slowly I caught my breath and regained my wits. And the balance of that academic year was awful and littered with schoolyard whispers. That's the kid who got trapped in the locker and freaked the hell out. And much of my life since that day has been a meticulously crafted strategy to avoid the confined spaces of elevators, overcrowded subway cars, long tunnels, airplanes, and middle seats. I hate middle seats. This, of course, is known as claustrophobia. And this irrational fear extends well beyond the purely physical realm. Any situation from which I cannot easily extricate myself triggers different degrees of alarm. This condition makes, for example, sitting somewhere in the interior of the orchestra section at Cats or any dramatic performance completely intolerable. Fortunately, I loathe musical theater. In closely examining the nature of this fear, I find it multi-layered. There is the dread associated with the anticipation of losing control. Then there is the panic attack itself with its requisite sweatiness, lightheadedness, heartbeat acceleration, and for me, profound nausea. And lastly, there is the fear of judgment, the post-attack public evaluation that elicits a feeling of potential embarrassment or failure. So claustrophobia is a learned fear as opposed to an innate fear, and frequently the product of a traumatic event, like the locker. Now, anxiety can often be mitigated through a type of conscious unavoidance. Now, I lived in New York City for 25 years. Obviously, I rode elevators and packed into taxis and notched probably 2 million frequent flyer miles. The accomplishment of riding the A train at rush hour may seem quite inconsequential to you, but in doing so, for me, my angst was tempered and my confidence bolstered, at least temporarily. Now, I'll share with you one more story. I lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn for 15 years between 2002 and 2017. Now, when I first moved there, it was a relatively desolate warehouse district and nobody took the subway. It was like plastic bags blowing like sagebrush on the platform. But after a decade of gentrification, the train in and out of Manhattan was jam-packed. So one summer day, I sturdied myself and hopped the L train to a meeting on the west side of Manhattan. The subway car was so crowded that my nose literally pushed against the glass window, making me appear somewhat porcine from the outside. Now, the trajectory of the L train sloped downward and traveled underneath the East River. It was an indication of this submarine journey. Your ears would pop as you descended under the water. Now, of course, I did my damnedest to not consciously fixate on the fact that I was journeying underneath a massive river with billions of pounds of pressure in a small steel tube brimming with nose-pierced, somewhat malodorous bohemians. You might sense where this is going. Halfway through the passage underneath the river, the train came to an abrupt stop. It exhaled brusquely, making a sound similar to the removal of an air hose on a tire valve stem. The air conditioning ceased blowing through the vents, and the car sank, resting on its haunches. After 5 minutes or so, an uneasiness crept in, and I started to feel the nausea well up from my stomach and into my throat. The blood drained from my head, and my pallor turned gray. Fear was setting in, but there was nowhere to run and no one to fight. So eventually I froze, lifelessly crumpling to the ground, the availability of which was rather scarce. And there I lay, a grown man reduced to the position of a fetus for 20 minutes until the train hurtled forward, and I rolled out of that first stop dripping equally with sweat and shame, canceled my meeting, and walked the bridge back home, vowing to conquer this anxiety disorder, or at the very least, understand it. And here are some of my findings. Fear is ancient as sentient life on Earth. It is a fundamental, deeply wired reaction evolved over biological history to protect organisms, including humans, against perceived threat. Now, Homo sapiens, humans, have spent the majority of their time here on Earth as hunter-gatherers, foraging for edible plants and pursuing wild animals on the savanna. This fight or flight response to external stimuli has undeniable utility, keeping us safe from charging rhinoceroses roaming the Serengeti. In modern times, the likelihood of getting mauled by a horned odd-toed ungulate is minuscule, but human biology hasn't evolved significantly over the past 12,000 years. However, the threats have evolved, or devolved. There were no lockers, subways, planes, or elevators in East Africa in 10,000 BC. The menaces of modernity tend to be more psychological than physiological. So let's take a brief foray into the neurobiology of fear. The fright is a product of the brain and mediated by our autonomic nervous system, which regulates bodily functions such as heart rate, digestion, respiratory rate, pupillary response, urination, sexual arousal. Now, this system functions autonomously, hence its name, below the crust of conscious effort. The autonomic nervous system has two primary divisions, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The parasympathetic nervous system is most associated with rest and digest, decreasing respiration and heart rate and increasing gastrointestinal activity. The sympathetic nervous system directs the body's rapid involuntary response to dangerous or stressful situations. A flash flood of hormones boosts the body's alertness and heart rate, sending extra blood to the muscles. Now, how does this work exactly? So the fight, flight, or freeze response is initiated in a region of the brain called the amygdala. Now, this almond-shaped mass of neurons in the temporal lobe is dedicated to detecting the emotional salience of stimuli. A threat, such as the sight of a drunk man running toward you with a chainsaw, triggers a fear reaction in the amygdala, which in turn activates neural areas responsible for motor functions relating to either putting up a fight, getting the hell out of Dodge, or, like me in the locker, becoming a possum, or on the subway, I should say. Now, what ensues is an internal debate between fear and reason, as if there could be any deliberation more emblematic of our times. Now, at the risk of glazing your ears over with biojargon, I'll delve one layer deeper. Now, the amygdala interfaces with the endocrine system via the hypothalamus. The hormones epinephrine and cortisol are secreted into the bloodstream, leading to a rise in blood pressure and pulmonary activity and a reduction of commotion in the stomach and intestines. Fatty acids convert into fuel for muscle use, our pupils dilate, and our vision becomes tunneled. So while the body preps for fight or flight, there is a simultaneous countervailing action that emerges in the hippocampus, the brain region dedicated to memory storage. This area mitigates fear response. Along with the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain, these centers of reason assess the true legitimacy of the threat. If the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex decide that the fear response is exaggerated, they can dampen the amygdala's activity. For example, if the raging man with the chainsaw is simply being projected on a movie screen and you're eating popcorn, then our sensible thinking brains will overpower the primal parts of the brain's automated fear response. All right, so intellectually, I can ascribe much of my claustrophobia to my penchant for fixating on the trauma of my past, the locker, the subway, and projecting it into the future as a harrowing anticipated memory. I recognize that fear is merely just an emotion arising and subsiding in consciousness moment to moment. He saunters into my house like an uninvited guest at my private dinner party, and as soon as I approach him, he disappears with a glass of wine. Now, when my mind snuggles into the quiet cradle of meditation, it knows that my fear of confined spaces is simply a phantom of my own projection. Rationally, I know I'll be fine. I can breathe and witness the fear as a passing phenomenon. However, despite this insight, I still occasionally feel the pall of terror envelop me in a crowded elevator. This is what I refer to as amygdala hijack, where the sympathetic nervous system eclipses my rational brain. So my friend and psychologist, Hala Khoury, posits that my locker incident might have left a somatic imprint. So this is a summation of her diagnosis. Now, when humans experience a terrorizing event that was inescapable, an inescapable shock trauma, the impulse to get away is not able to be expressed. So if we don't discharge that energy, the impulse gets trapped in the body. So for me, it's possible that each time I feel constricted, I reconnect to the intolerable feelings from that event, and the impulses to escape it also emerge. But even though my situations that I had were completely tolerable, they are associated with a terrorizing event, and my nervous system goes into overwhelm as a result. In his book, The Untethered Soul, Michael Singer refers to this intractable trauma as samskara, a recurring energy pattern that becomes stuck. So fear rears its head in myriad ways. Now, people feel the burden of phobias, from snakes to failure, from heights to judgment, from needles to death. Fear can be part of our personal story, in some ways girding our sense of identity. So how do we escape the clutches of fear? Well, here are some ways to mitigate, manage, and perhaps even eliminate fear responses and phobias. Now, I'm going to break these down into tactics and strategies. Tactics in this case are techniques that you can use to curtail panic and anxiety when fear arises. And strategies address the fear at its root and require regular practice and deeper explorations into the nature of the mind and consciousness. I will also touch on some new fascinating therapies that are emerging that may completely unwind long-held phobias. Okay, so the first tip is a breathing technique that you can employ when you're in a highly anxious situation. It's called 478, which happens to be the area code of Macon, Georgia. So to prepare for this practice, you rest the tip of your tongue against the roof of your mouth, right behind your front teeth. So you'll need to keep your tongue in place throughout the practice. And it takes practice to keep from moving your tongue when you exhale. So exhaling during 4-7-8 breathing can be easier when some people, when they purse their lips. So we'll see. Now the following steps should all be carried out in the cycle of one single breath. So first, let your lips part. Make a whooshing sound, exhaling completely through your mouth. So you just get everything out. Next, close your lips, inhaling silently through your nose as you count to 4 in your head. Then for 7 seconds, hold your breath. Then make another whooshing exhale from your mouth for 8 seconds. When you inhale again, you initiate a new cycle of breath. So practice this pattern for 4 full breaths. This practice releases the maximum amount of carbon dioxide, which decelerates the heart rate. A fast-beating heart is a large contributor to the feeling of being out of control. The breath is also a way into the autonomic nervous system, which is central to fear, as I discussed earlier. And through the breath, you can work to shift yourself from the sympathetic mode to a parasympathetic state. This pattern of breathing can also be quite useful when going to sleep. There are other breathing techniques like deep belly breathing, which I will demonstrate in another video. The second technique is more intellectual, and it is derived from my friend Chip Conley's book called Emotional Equations. Now, he wrote this book for male blockheads like me to understand their emotions through mathematical equations. And one such equation is this: anxiety equals powerlessness times uncertainty. So you don't need to be a mathematics wizard to realize that if you can lower one of the factors in this equation, then you will reduce your anxiety. Well, you can't impact powerlessness because, well, you're powerless. But you can tackle uncertainty. So I'll ground this technique in a specific example. So, like many people, I get quite anxious around public speaking, though I seem to be fairly adept at it. But I have trouble sleeping during the nights before taking the stage. I feel fidgety and distracted. I get quite nauseous, all of those symptoms. So I started to eliminate the elements of uncertainty through answering myriad questions about the situation. What was the size of the room in which I would be speaking? Would I be standing or sitting? Would I have a glass of water? Where would the exits be? Could I see a photo of the room? How many people would be there? And on and on and on. And if powerlessness in this equation was a 10, and the uncertainty started as a 10, well, if I could reduce the uncertainty to a 4, that lowered my anxiety from 100 to a quite manageable 40. I also use this technique for air travel, for example, which is another widespread fear. I choose my seat on the aisle. I learn the configuration on the plane, chicken or beef. So these are techniques. Now, the last technique I would recommend is radical candor or honest communication. So, for example, I abhor going to the dentist. And because I detest it, I tend to procrastinate going. But that's not a good or profitable idea. So when I get there, I tell my dentist how much I hate it, that the thought of getting Novocaine shots in my mouth makes me sick to my stomach. Now, obviously, he knows that most people hate coming to see him. So he's actually quite appreciative of my candor. And I am relieved of the burden of having to hide my fear and any judgment that might be concomitant with it. So similarly, if you fear public speaking, you can get on the stage and make a joke about how bloody nervous you are. It immediately humanizes you to the audience. They feel more connected, it breaks the ice, and as soon as you begin to flow, generally you lose all the nervousness. Okay, so those are some techniques. Now, let's discuss strategies. Now, to do this, it will require some deeper philosophical inquiry. So humans exist at this intersection, the intersection of consciousness and personhood. Let me define. Consciousness is the space in which we perceive thoughts, sensations, and emotions arising moment to moment. This experience life unfolds in the now. We are simply bobbing down this river of impermanence, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, and hearing. Our personhood is the contents of consciousness. It is, in many ways, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves that inform what it is like to be us. So this narrative life shapes our identity through the collection of infinitesimally small slices of space-time. Our lives become a stack of these memories, like a towering heap of cheese singles. One moment is so much like the last one and the one before. So while there is no conventional stable self within the space of consciousness, our narrative life provides us with this physical and psychological continuity that seems to codify our perceived identity. In a sense, our narrative life sits within our experienced life and contributes stories, sometimes quite traumatic, that can elicit the appearance of fear, anger, jealousy, other emotions. Of course, not all fear is detrimental. Fear can also be understood as awe or reverence for something powerful. You can recognize the potency and potential danger, let's say, of a massive hurricane, and in turn, take shelter. The fear can serve as a barometer for making sensible choices. But most of the fears we experience on a regular basis are extremely limiting and in some cases paralyzing. So if fear is prohibiting you from reaching your potential, the antidote may consist of applying some of this theory and training to direct experience. We can train the mind to witness negative emotions and thoughts as simply phenomena arising and subsiding in consciousness. Don't put any judgment or valence on it. Mindfulness, sacred non-judgmental presence, helps us not to fixate or identify with old stories. Instead, we let them go. Now, this requires consistent meditation in which we simply observe negative emotions appear. We don't assign any valence to them. We mentally wave at it and just watch it disappear. We can also witness thoughts, sounds, and sensations in a very similar fashion. Now, we can apply this cognitive training to playing with the edges of our fears, to experimenting with discomfort. For example, I can choose to encase myself like a vegan sausage in a sensory deprivation tank, a tight cylindrical space that would normally elicit a significant freak out. I can witness the nausea, the dizziness, and the myriad symptoms of fear arise without assigning any valence to them. If the fear becomes unbearable, I can just bail out. Now, this exercise is tantamount to going to a mental gym. I'm building the muscle of the prefrontal cortex. Now, at some point, certainly, I will be confined to a small space against my will. This absence of choice will test my mental musculature. So lastly, there are some fascinating new therapies emerging to address phobias. Here is one. There's a doctor named Meryl Kint at the University of Amsterdam, and she's conducted a number of studies in which participants were recruited who had particular phobias. For example, arachnophobia, or a fear of spiders. Others were recruited who suffered from anxiety associated with some past traumatic experience, such as being mugged or assaulted at gunpoint. So in these studies, participants experienced the fear-inducing stimuli. For example, the arachnophobia patients handled a large tarantula in a jar. The painful memory group answered questions about their memory and verbally described it in minute detail. Now, once the fear state and the memories associated with it had been fully activated as much as possible, some of the participants took a dose of propranolol and others took a placebo. Propranolol is a beta blocker medication which is often used to treat high blood pressure, heartbeat, arrhythmia, migraine headaches, and a variety of other ailments. Now, beta blockers in general block the receptor sites for adrenaline and norepinephrine, which are associated with stress-based arousal. They assist in keeping the heart rate slow, in a way neutering the impacts of your fight or flight response. So somewhat amazingly, in the days after, and in a few cases months after, many of these patients who received the beta blocker reported a dramatic or complete drop in their fear. It seems as if the propranolol, by blocking the participants' ability to fully experience the fear, also blocked the tendency to reconsolidate that fear into long-term memory. Crazy, right? So I hope you find some of these techniques and strategies useful. One famous quote about fear, the most famous one, was articulated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on his inauguration day in 1933. You know it. So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. So our proclivity for personal phobias plays out in broader society. Media propagates fear through sensationalism and biased editorial in the name of selling ads. Authoritarians stir up a frenzy of fright around crime and jobs and offer us scapegoats as a means to seize and maintain power. Social media addicts post chilling disinformation in exchange for neural rewards. The result is this: we are an amygdala hijacked culture, trapped in a locker, tethered to incessant outrage. Now, if we are to fulfill our individual and collective potential, then we must cultivate the ability to discern between true threat and nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. And this capacity only emerges out of a commitment to rigorously examine the nature of the mind. Consciousness is a double-edged saber. The cognizance of our own impermanence is the sharp point in our collective side. Yet this sentience provides the opportunity for the neo-mammalian brain to dull the reptilian, to pour the water of reason onto the fire of fear. Otherwise, we spend our lives fruitlessly kicking the door of the locker. It is our choice. We can be a host for reason or a hostage to fear.